Do you know, there was a dictator who ruled China at that time. He is Mao Zedong. Born into a poor farming family, since childhood, Mao had to work hard and live a concerned life. Even though later in life his family's economic situation improved, the hardships in his childhood had a big impact on his later life. As a child, Mao was sent to study at elementary school. His education as a child also included the teachings of Confucian classics. But at the age of 13, his father told him to stop going to school and sent him to work in the fields. Mao rebelled and was determined to complete his education, so he was determined to run away from home and continue his education elsewhere. In 1905, he took the state examination, which at that time began to erase old Confucianism, replaced by Western-style education. This marked the beginning of intellectual uncertainty in China. In 1911, Mao was involved in the Xinhai Revolution, which was a revolution against the Qing dynasty, which resulted in the collapse of the Chinese Empire, which had ruled for more than 2,000 years since 221 BCE. In 1912, the Republic of China was proclaimed by Sun Yat-sen and China officially entered the Republican era. Mao then continued his schooling and studied many things, including Western culture. In 1918 he graduated and then studied at Beijing University. There he would meet the Marxist founders of the CCP. Mao's philosophy: Mao was not actually an original philosopher. His ideas were based on other fathers of socialism such as Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. But he thought a lot about the dialectical materialism that was the basis of socialism, and the application of these ideas in practice as carried out by Mao could be said to be original. Mao can also be said to be a Chinese philosopher who had the greatest influence in the 20th century. Mao's most important philosophical concept is conflict. According to him, conflict is universal and absolute. It exists in the development process of all things and permeates all processes from beginning to end. Karl Marx's model of history is also based on the principle of conflict. The oppressing class and the oppressed class, capital and work, are in eternal conflict. At some point this will lead to a crisis and the workers will win. In the end, this new situation will lead to another crisis, but logically all the final processes, according to Mao, will bring us to a stable and harmonious balance. Mao came to believe that all conflicts are universal and absolute, so in other words they are eternal. Mao's concept of conflict is similar to the philosophical concept of yin-yang. It all sounds like a religious dogma. Below is an excerpt of his thoughts on conflict. In science, everything is divided based on certain conflicts inherent in each research object. Conflict is the basis of a form of scientific discipline. Several examples can be presented here: negative and positive numbers in mathematics, action and reaction in mechanics, positive and negative electric currents in physics, attraction and repulsion in chemistry, class conflict in social sciences, attack and defense in science. War, idealism and materialism, as well as metaphysical and dialectical perspectives in philosophy and beyond. These are all research objects of different scientific disciplines because each discipline has its own specific conflicts and its own essence or essence. The examples given by Mao Zedong regarding conflict in different disciplines were taken from Lenin. Some analogies are appropriate but others are not. Negative and positive numbers are a bad example of Marxist dialectics because their differences are not dynamic. There are only new negative and positive numbers emerging. Mao's opinion becomes even more doubtful when he says that these conflicts are the essence of the scientific discipline in question. Negative and positive numbers are not the essence of mathematics, nor are metaphysics and dialectics the essence of philosophy. Mao was an educated person and his wrong understandings can be explained because he was very obsessed with this concept of conflict. This obsession also influenced his political decisions, as will be explained below. Mao's second important concept is his concept of knowledge, which he also took from Marxism. Mao argued that knowledge is a continuation of experience in the physical realm and that experience is the same as involvement. If you seek knowledge, then you must engage with changing circumstances. If you want to know how a guava tastes, then the guava must be changed by eating it. If you want to know the structure of an atom, then you have to carry out physical and chemical experiments to change the state of this atom. If you want to know the theory and methods of revolution, then you have to follow it. All true knowledge arises from direct experience. Only after one gained experience could one leap forward. After that, the knowledge is put into practice again, which makes someone gain experience again, and so on. Here it is shown that Mao not only knew Marxism but also Neo-Confucianism as stated by Wang Yangmin, who lived in the 15th to 16th centuries. Mao and his party, Mao Zedong, proclaimed the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949. Since it was proclaimed by Mao in 1949, the People's Republic of China has not been recognized by the United States. The United States continues to recognize the Nationalist Republic of China, which since 1949 has only controlled the island of Formosa or Taiwan and its surroundings. China, which since the founding of the UN in 1945 has been a permanent member of the Security Council along with the United States, Great Britain, France and the Soviet Union, Russia, as the winner of World War II, is still represented as well. The only representative is the nationalist government, which currently only governs Taiwan. This was strange because mainland China, which at that time had a population of approximately 800 million people, was not represented at the UN, representing only Taiwan, which at that time had a population of perhaps no more than 10 million people. The founding of the People's Republic of China was proclaimed in Beijing by Mao Zedong on October 1, 1949. In the first year, impressive economic improvements were seen. But by the end of 1950, the country's progress was reduced as a result of the Great Step Forward policy. This big step forward consists of two areas, agriculture and industry. In the agricultural sector, the Great Step Forward focused on massive irrigation projects and the formation of people's communes with total collectivization of agricultural products. Collectivization is not within private households anymore. So the new system is completely unproductive. There is no encouragement from farmers to show a desire to increase production or quality. So at the end of the 1960s, the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, began to approach the People's Republic of China, and finally, with the approval of the Soviet Union, the PRC became a member of the UN Security Council starting in 1972 and replaced Taiwan. Mao's party was founded in 1921 and Mao became more and more vocal day by day. Between 1934 and 1935 he played a major role and led the Chinese Red Army on the Long March. Then since 1937 he helped fight the Dai Nippon Army, which occupied much of China. Finally World War II ended and civil war flared again. In this war against the nationalists, Mao became the leader of the Reds and he finally won in 1949. On October 1, 1949, the People's Republic of China was proclaimed and the nationalist Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, fled to Taiwan. In the CCP, Mao himself since 1943 was chairman of the party secretariat and Politburo, but in fact he controlled the entire party until he died in 1976. The leadership may not have been as vulgarly cruel as Stalin's, but the violence of his policies and his self-willed behavior brought the Chinese people down into ruin. An incredible misery, the revolution in China in 1949 was an important historical event, especially for radical movements in the Third World, including Indonesia. Many communist parties and other radical groups were inspired by Mao's theories. And the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s was also an inspiration for leftist student movements to this day. Unfortunately, this inspiration is very misguided. The revolution led by Mao did not build a socialist society where the workers themselves determine economic, social, and political policies. The Maoist regime is controlled by an authoritarian bureaucracy, and the PRC economy is not free from capitalist logic, even though large companies are state-owned. And finally, after Mao died, the PRC, which was called socialist, began to transform into a country with a market economy and became increasingly similar to other countries. This could happen because basically, the goals of Mao and the Chinese Communist Party were not to build socialism, but to build a strong national economy. Workers and farmers became victims. Mao's history begins with the collapse of China's revolutionary labor movement. Between 1925 and 1927, Chinese cities experienced a number of workers' uprisings led by the Young Communist Party. Mass strikes erupted in Hong Kong and workers rioted. Armed forces controlled the streets of Guangzhou City. This struggle began under the umbrella of the nationalist movement, but then developed more broadly into a permanent revolution that became increasingly socialist in nature. However, at that time the international communist movement, Comintern, had begun to be dominated by Stalin's policy that revolutions in the Third World had to go through two stages. According to Stalin, the revolution in China should remain within the boundaries of a democratic revolution only. That's why the Chinese communists were told to hand over their weapons to the nationalists. They obey, and then massacred by the nationalist group. Some communist units in the countryside managed to survive and they gathered in the mountains. Communist organizations in urban areas have almost disappeared completely. Mao became leader and developed a new strategy with a pivot to the peasant class. In the early 1930s, the communists succeeded in establishing a number of red bases in several remote areas. Local governments were labeled Soviets, even though they bore no resemblance to the democratic Soviets, workers' councils, that emerged during the Russian Revolution. Mao's Soviets were a military dictatorship by communist soldiers, who were rather benevolent towards the peasantry. But this is far from revolutionary democracy in the Marxist sense. The base was attacked 5 times by nationalist government troops, until finally the communists were forced to withdraw from these areas, taking the long march to the Yan'an area. In 1931, Japan invaded China, and the corrupt nationalist government was unable to resist, so the main cities were occupied by the Japanese. After the long march, Mao raised the slogan of resistance to the occupation. Once Japan lost the war in the Pacific region and began to withdraw troops from China, the Communist Army was able to defeat the Japanese army, then take city after city from the hands of the nationalists. In 1949, Mao and the Communist Party had controlled China. Said Mao, "China has risen, but who rises? Not the working class, and not urban residents in general." As explained by John Molyneux in Where is the True Marxist Tradition, Mao still expressed sentiments about the leadership role of the proletariat who would guide the peasant class. But in fact, the proletariat played no role at all in the 1949 revolution. Mao even wrote that year, "It is hoped that all workers and employees in all fields will continue to work and all enterprises will continue as usual." So proletarian leadership can only mean the leadership of the Communist Party. Considering that the number of workers who join the party is only small, then proletarian leadership only means proletarian ideology, which is actually Stalinist program. The revolution of 1949 is usually understood as a peasant revolution. But what was the relationship between the Communist Party leadership and the peasantry in a guerrilla war? John Molyneux argues further. The guerrilla army would consist almost 100% of people from peasant backgrounds, but only a small minority of the peasant class would fight. Mao's army numbered several million, but that was only a small percentage of China's 500 million peasants. This is unavoidable in guerrilla warfare, which uses hit-and-run tactics, with troops always moving from place to place, so that the guerrilla army did not truly join the peasant masses and its mentality became elitist. This elitist mentality is also very striking in the orders given by Mao to the guerrilla troops in their interactions with the peasant class: be polite. help them as much as possible. All things borrowed must be returned. All things purchased must be paid for. These orders prove how unequal the relationship between the soldiers and the peasants was. These orders were indeed very necessary, because objective conditions always tempted the soldiers to exploit and oppress the peasants. Meanwhile, the situation of the working class was much different. It is very difficult to imagine a revolutionary workers' organization that would have to warn its cadres to unite the proletarians. In fact, the Maoist revolution was a military bureaucratic revolution with a nationalist, not Marxist, bent. Mao himself stated in July 1949 that our policy now is to regulate capitalism, not to destroy it. Several years later, in the face of pressure from Western imperialism, Mao indeed implemented changes that seemed socialist by nationalizing large companies. But the old managers often become managers in the new system, while the workers do not participate in managing the workplaces. In rural areas, peasants suffer a similar fate. In essence, this regime is more worthy of being called state capitalist, because the working people are not involved at all in government, initially. The pattern of industrial development in China took place according to the classical Stalinist model implemented by Stalin himself in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. However, the results of this pattern did not satisfy the authorities. Even though China's economy was growing rapidly, Western economies were booming at that time, so China was increasingly left behind. Therefore, the regime implemented a policy that was determined to catch up, by increasing the rate of exploitation of workers and peasants. In the Great Leap of 1958 to 1960, the regime set extreme production targets, and carried out mass campaigns to force working people to work hard in an effort to achieve these targets. Even though the workers and farmers worked until they were exhausted, the results were not yet adequate. Then the company leaders lied and falsified production data. The consequences were severe, especially in the countryside where the peasantry was forced into large communes. These communes were heralded as a step towards communism. It's actually very similar to the authoritarian barracks communism that Marx condemned. The harvest results were very disappointing, until in 1961 there was a famine in several areas and armed rebellions exploded in 2 provinces. In the end, the government lost. The Great Leap was stopped, and the peasantry was invited to take up private production. Mao was somewhat marginalized, and other people determined economic policy. Yields began to rise again, but the gap between rich and poor farmers began to increase as well. Mao himself had not yet given up. In 1965 he mobilized his supporters under the banner of the Cultural Revolution. Once again, the revolution was trumpeted as a communist struggle. Actually, Mao just wanted to hit his enemies in the ruling class. In the capital Beijing, the effort succeeded without chaos. But in these areas Mao had to instigate conflicts, and the Red Guard, Maoist groups, took to the streets to attack the authorities. A revolutionary atmosphere did develop in some areas, because the authorities were hated by the people. The Red Guard, consisting of students, insulted and even abused local officials. But this campaign quickly crossed all boundaries. Teachers were also persecuted, and museums were burned because they were considered westernized and decadent. These events were accompanied by the cult of Mao as the sun that never sets. As expressed in an order to the Marines, we must obey Chairman Mao's instructions, even if they are not understood by us. Finally, Mao increasingly lost control over the chaos caused by the Cultural Revolution. Bureaucrats in the regions who felt threatened responded by deploying their own Red Guards, until groups of students clashed everywhere, and the ruling class became increasingly concerned that a civil war could break out. Even worse, in their eyes, the working class began to move independently with a wave of strikes. Then a group emerged that was Marxist in its original sense. The Shang Wu-lin group developed a critical analysis that Mao's regime was not socialist. In a manifesto entitled "Where is China Going?" they argued that the social contradictions that gave rise to the Cultural Revolution were contradictions between the power of the new bureaucratic bourgeoisie and the masses of the people. So that society needs more fundamental changes. We must overthrow the bureaucratic bourgeoisie by abolishing the old state apparatus and carrying out a revolution social and implementing a new social order. The rulers responded with cruel repression. Young men were thrown into remote areas in large numbers to destroy the Red Guard. Hundreds of thousands of people were massacred in Guangxi province and several other places. The repression occurred on Mao's own orders, but the final stage of the Cultural Revolution was also a major defeat for Mao and the Maoists. In the development of the Communist Party, it not only focused on agriculture, but at the same time also decentralized industry, especially heavy industry. Meanwhile, the country benefits from the decentralization of the industrial complex through this great step forward. Examples include the development of steel kilns, which are useful for making equipment, such as household furniture, melted down into useless pieces of metal. The effects of this great step forward were clearly visible when China experienced serious floods and drought in 1959 and 1960. This resulted in millions of Chinese people experiencing severe hunger. After this incident, many of the Great Step Forward policies were abandoned, except for the decentralization of the steel industry. The People's Commune system was still alive, and even revived during the Cultural Revolution several years later. This is because Mao Zedong was behind all this. The Cultural Revolution was introduced by Mao Zedong in 1966, because he wanted to eliminate rivals in the Communist Party hierarchy, such as Liu Shaoke. Mao took advantage of the support of the population to confront party officials who were considered disloyal to him and lacked revolutionary spirit. At first, the pretext for the Cultural Revolution was strongly suspected of having counter-revolutionary tendencies among intellectuals. But then it expanded to include bureaucracy and authority, except not including Mao Zedong. The Cultural Revolution was largely orchestrated by Mao Zedong's wife, Jiang Qing. After the Red Guard group was first formed by Beijing students, the situation in the country became uncontrollable. This group of Red Guards moved against all bureaucracy and destroyed a number of religious and historical sites. During the 4 years of the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1970, practically all universities and schools closed. In the first year of the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1967, the country was thrown into chaos by the actions of the Red Guards, who freely attacked anything. The targets are low and middle officials and party cadres. Even high-ranking officials, except Mao and those closest to him. Mao's competitors in the highest echelons of the party were eliminated, and Mao wanted more of the military to be part of this cultural revolution. So in 1967, the Chinese People's Liberation Army was formed as the vanguard of the Cultural Revolution. Minister of Defense Lin Biao became the second most powerful person in China after Mao Zedong, and was deliberately chosen to support success. However, in 1971, Mao began to be disliked by the officers of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, because of his penetration into all aspects of life. This was clearly seen when Mao was criticized by the TPMC leaders, and even the defense minister Lin Biao tried to threaten Mao's life. The circumstances of what happened on September 13, 1971 have never been clarified. It was explained that Lin Biao and his family tried to escape by Trident jet to Russia. But allegedly, they didn't bring enough petrol, so the jet crashed in Mongolia. Mao Zedong died on September 9, 1976. His successor was Hua Guofeng, who had served as prime minister after Zhou Enlai's death in January 1976. Hua Guofeng was a candidate who was mutually agreed upon by the radical and pragmatic groups of the CCP, even though in fact he had no power of his own. Mao and his political policies. Mao distinguished two types of conflict: antagonistic conflict and non-antagonistic conflict. According to him, antagonistic conflicts can only be resolved by fighting, while non-antagonistic conflicts can be resolved by discussion. According to Mao, the conflict between workers and capitalists is an antagonistic conflict, while the conflict between the Chinese people and the party is a non-antagonistic conflict. In 1956, Mao introduced a new political policy in which intellectuals were allowed to express their opinions as a compromise against the party, which suppressed it because it wanted to avoid cruel oppression, accompanied by the motto, "Let 100 flowers bloom and 100 different minds compete." But ironically, this political policy failed. The intellectuals felt dissatisfied and issued many criticisms. Mao himself argued that he had been betrayed by them and he was taking revenge. Around 700,000 members of the intelligentsia were arrested and forced to work in rural areas. In 1958, Mao launched what he called the Great Leap Forward, in which rural areas were totally reorganized. Everywhere village associations, communes, were founded. Economically, it turns out this all failed. These communes became units that were too large and could not be managed. It is estimated that nearly 20 million Chinese people died in vain at that time. Mao believed in an eternal revolution. He also believed that every revolution must produce counter-revolutionaries. Therefore, he regularly eradicated and arrested what he considered his political opponents and traitors or counter-revolutionaries. The most dramatic and heartbreaking event was the Cultural Revolution, which occurred in 1966. In the 1960s, students all over the world enjoyed rebelling against what they considered the establishment or those in power. Likewise in China. The difference is that in China they were supported by their lecturers and party officials, including Mao himself. The students and lecturers set up the so-called Red Guard, a paramilitary unit. Equipped with Mao's Red Book, they attacked the lackeys of capitalism and Western influences and other counter-revolutionaries. As an example of their fanaticism, they, among other things, refused to stop on the highway when the red light is on because they believe that the color red, which is a symbol of socialism, cannot possibly mean something is stopping. So the members of the Red Guard in 1966 were so blind in eradicating the counter-revolutionaries that the Chinese state was in a very precarious condition and almost destroyed. The economy is not working. Finally, Mao was forced to deploy the People's Liberation Army to deal with them and stem their fanaticism. The result was a civil war that only ended in 1968. In 1976, Mao Zedong died. After that, the People's Republic of China became increasingly open. Normalization of diplomatic relations with Indonesia was also realized in 1992. At this time, China appeared as a giant that had just woken up from its slumber, and its economic growth was very rapid. China could even surpass Russia in its development. What is being debated now is whether this could all be achieved thanks to Mao's services or because his influence was already thin. After Mao died, his supporters, including his wife, were arrested and punished. And the government's economic policies increasingly opened the way for market mechanisms, so that China began to take the capitalist path that Mao had always worried about. Once again the economy recovered, but once again the gap between the poor and the rich is getting bigger. The same social elements remained: the ruling class, especially party, state, and industrial officials. The working class and peasant class continue to be the oppressed classes. In fact, these pro-market policies do not mean a shift to capitalism. Capitalism has existed in China for a long time, in the form of state capitalism. That's all that Mao built.